So to get ready for creating some of our particles in the scene, let's go ahead and get rid of some of what's inside of this environment. We'll go ahead and lower this back to 0. And because we have created prefabs with everything that's here, we can just go back through and get rid of these assets here. Now, we got rid of them inside of the hierarchy. Remember, the hierarchy is just the scene that we're working with. The project still has all of our files right in here. So if we were to just drag back out our asteroid, there it is. If we were going to take our block is right there. Our bullets inside, and our player prefab right there. So everything is still available to us. It's just inside of our project file. We were just using the hierarchy as a way to create some of those basic mock-up assets in the beginning. So with those set up and a nice empty clear scene here, let's go back in and create a particle system. So in the hierarchy, in the create, we're going to go to the particle system. Our particle system gets created, and with our default emitter, just emitting out some basic little sprites that come and go. What we want to do is create something that actually has a little bit more force. We want to push our particles out, make it look somewhat like a basic explosion that comes out. So let's go back in. Let's take a peek at some of the particle options that we have in here. So I'm going to go ahead and just close up some of these rollouts so it doesn't look quite as intimidating. There are quite a number of options here. And the first couple that we have, we've got some min size and max size. This is just the size of the particle. And we have a minimum size that it can go to, the maximum size, and then there's a randomness that happens between these two. So let's say we start bumping up the max size. We can see that it starts growing those particles. We also see that the min size still gets created here and there as a smaller particle. If we were to bump both of these up though, to let's say 1 and 1, then all the particles get created at a 1 and 1 size. There's no variation in between. For us, we're going to want something that has a little variation. So we're going to go maybe about a 0.5 and a 1. That might give us what we want. Now we're still just being created right here in the center. The next thing that we look at, we've got min energy and a max energy. This is like the life of our particle. How long is it going to last before it actually disappears? So right now it's lasting at a 3 and a 3. So let's say we were just to take this down. And whenever you're dealing with or experimenting with new systems, always play with these variables. Take it as low as it can go, take it as high as it can go, and then from there you're going to start to become more comfortable with, well, what does this system do? What does this variable actually mean? So if we were to take this down to, let's say, a 0.1 and a 0.1, we start noticing that they don't last very long at all. This really is the life of this particle. It creates an interesting effect as it kind of pops around. If maybe we were doing camera flashes from an audience, this might actually work nice for us. But we do want this to last a little bit longer, so we're going to bump up the amount of time it lasts just a little bit more. Let's say we take this up to maybe about 0.5 for the min energy. And let's say a 0.5 here. This way we get a feel for how long is 0.5. And 0.5 comes in pretty fast, it goes pretty fast, but we are dealing with an explosion, so we don't want it to last too long. But let's go ahead and change up so we have a little bit of variation in this. We're going to change up the min and max energy. We'll take this one up to, let's say, maybe 0.75. We can see that we start getting the particles lasting a little bit longer. Now what we want to do next, we've got the emission amount, and we're going to hold off on the emissions. This is just how many particles are we actually putting on screen at one time. And here we're saying that we can push out about 50 particles. Now when we're optimizing for the game production, depending on what we can push, if we're DirectX 11, then we could push a whole lot more. If we're dealing with a lower end machine, then we have to pull some of those back, especially if we're looking at what about are we dealing with a iPhone or some sort of mobile device. So we'll hold off on these two guys. We'll look down at the next one. We've got the world velocity. The world velocity is pushing a value just from our world coordinates onto an object or onto the particle, and you can see here we're just simply pushing our particles up along the y-axis, or we can push those particles back down and have them falling down. And from here we can go, well, it's not quite what we want because we're pushing in a direction. We could try pushing in each different direction, and then we say, well, that still doesn't quite give us a bang, an explosion in between. So We'll continue on down with our options. We say, well, the world velocity doesn't quite give us what we want. What about the local velocity? This is just based on the local axis coordinate system of the object. So again, if I rotate, it's going to come based on the object's coordinate. So we're getting velocity, but not quite the push that we want. We have a random velocity, and that one's simply going to send things in different directions. We've got our emitter velocity scale, which doesn't quite do what we want, but then we have a tangent velocity. Let's take a peek at our tangent velocity. Let's say we want to push things out in a couple different directions. We'll say along our x and y. This way we're going along this axis and this axis. Say we have maybe a 1 and a 1. And we can kind of start seeing a little bit of something happening here. Let's go ahead and keep going down, take another peek at something else that we've got here. We also have something called our ellipsoid. This is the range basically that we're creating the particles around. Right now all the particles are being created with a 1 by 1 by 1 unit space. So let's tighten that up. Our explosion really isn't going to happen in that big of an area. It's going to be a tight, small little area. So let's go in here and say, oh, let's do about a 0.1, 0.1, 0.1. A little bit of a range, but not all that much. And that way, when we look at it, we can see that we've actually got a little bit of a push out. Nice randomness happening inside of it. And let's even add a little bit of a vertical. Not too much, because we're going to play with our axis in a different way. So that's looking pretty good like that. And let's play with our tangent velocity a little bit more. Let's push that one up. Let's say, if we push this up, we can see it pushing out faster. So we might be able to get more of a pop with it the higher we go. Here we can see that we go up, we broke it, we pushed too far. Let's pull that guy back in just a little bit. And that's generally what you're always doing. You're pushing effects, you're pushing things until they break, then you want to pull it back just a little bit. So let's say we take it to somewhere in this range. We get a nice little push out. The next thing we could do is start looking at, well, maybe my particle sizes need to be bigger now. I'm pushing things out more, but I'm not quite getting the type of effect maybe I want for my explosion. Well, we could go back up to our min and max size, and if we were to increase this one a little bit, we could start getting a little bit more of larger puffs, more of a full shape coming out. We could increase maybe our min size a little bit more. We see that we're starting to get an interesting shape here. Now we're also getting one continuous particle stream. It's not actually ending. It's not just giving us a pop. Now how do we get to that? We can change that with one simple option in here. We have a one-shot option. If we left click on that, there we go. It's just creating that one particle. It's pushing it all out at once, and it gives us that nice little explosion that we want to play with. Now you will notice that right now it's giving us a top view. It's giving us the view that we actually want, but when we're on a side view right now, we don't quite get that same effect. It's just coming out on the side. So let's say we go back in and we changed up some of our numbers. What if we pushed here instead? Then we get a nice full explosion all the way around. And it comes all the way out. Now is the explosion a little bit big? If it is a little bit big, then we can always go back to our energy. How long does that explosion last? And right now, maybe it's lasting too long. Let's say we take that back just a little bit. Let's take this one back just a little bit. We can see that we start getting rid of that explosion a little bit faster. We still have a nice little pop that happens when it comes out. We could even slow down the velocity on here. Instead of with the 4, we could take this maybe back to a 3. There we go. And again, this is something you just play with. You're playing with the numbers. You need a basic understanding of, what direction are these variables going to push my particles in. Do I want to be able to rotate them? Am I trying to move them in one direction? And then play with those numbers, play with the lifespan of that object, play with the size of the particle to start pushing it in the direction that you want to create that effect. So with this one, we've got a pretty good tangent velocity assigned to it. We can also go back in and say, let's do a little bit of a random angular velocity, or at least a random rotation. That way when it comes out, we get a nice little push out so we feel like there's some force coming from it. Our one-shot works just fine. The ellipsoid size works fine. Now let's go on down to our particle animator. We'll roll this one back up. And in the particle animator, we've got options for applying color, changing the color up, changing out the alpha so that we can fade the object in and out. Now, for us, we could also apply a material, but because we are keeping this simple and we are keeping this as a mock-up, we're going to keep it just with our particle animator, not apply any additional materials to it. So I'm going to left-click on top of my color, and inside of here I can see that our alpha starts at just about completely transparent, and we start at a white. So we could go back in and say maybe we want a little dusty kind of color inside of there, just a hint of a yellow at the beginning. Now you could close this and then click again, or you can simply left click on the next color and it sets you up for the next one. Here the alpha starts in where we're getting closer to seeing the full object, and we could go back in. Let's say we start going with a little more color once again. We'll go to our next one. And do we want like a little bit more yellow? Do we want more of a cool color? All depends on what you want to achieve by the end of your particle. I'm going to create mine to be a little bit more of a dusty color. And we could always do an additional particle on top of that. There we go. And if you want to change up the alpha, it's simply by changing up this alpha value at the bottom. And this is just how quickly it's going to fade in and out by setting that alpha on each one of these levels. We'll take this guy down just a little more so we have a nice fade out at the end. Okay, our other options that we have, we've got some world rotations, local rotations. We don't really need these for our particle. It changes up how it spins around. The size grow. Now this is just allowing us to make our particle larger as it goes out. So we could expand this one up so that as we go out it actually gets larger. And that one kind of works, kind of doesn't. We'd have to change up our lifespan a little bit more so it would work better for us. We can also shrink it down. So we could shrink our particles out a little bit. So again, depends on what are we going for, what's that effect, which goes back to the fact that when you start these projects, make sure you really know what it is you want to create so that you're not sitting there wondering, what do I do? So here we have our random force, and we've got another force that we can use. Right now we're actually looking pretty good. We really don't want to play with our forces. The damping effect, we don't need to mess with that one right now. We're doing just fine. The one we do want to check is our auto destruct. So we're going to click on our auto destruct so that when this particle is done playing, it removes itself. The other option we have is our particle renderer. Inside of here, are we casting shadows, receiving shadows? If we are going to load a material, we can load our material right in here. We're using the default particle that comes with Unity. We're not going to be stretching these particles any because the puffy clouds work just fine. If we were to stretch them, we could turn them into a stretched billboard. And then we could actually stretch these out or pull those in. You can see where these are going to have some nice effects eventually with some of the other things that we'll do. But we'll set this just to our billboard for now. And no UV animations, so at this point we have a pretty viable explosion, one that's good for a mock-up that we can use. And let's go back in and actually name this something. So instead of just particle system, let's call this our explosion. And you'll notice that we don't have any kind of prefab for it, so let's go ahead and go back in. Let's create a prefab. And we'll call this our prefab explosion. we're just going to drag our particle from our hierarchy onto our prefab explosion, drop it in there. And that way we now have our particle set up, and we can use that. We're going to go ahead and just delete that guy. And one other particle that we can create a jet type particle so that we can have a little bit of a jet engine on our player spaceship. So we'll go in here, and for a jet engine we're going to be looking at creating a stretched particle. So we're going to stretch our particle, and we're going to make our size, we'll just set these to 1. Our min and max energies, we can set those. Our amount, we can adjust with that one. So let's say our energy levels, we'll leave it 3 and 3, our emissions at 50 and 50. And let's get these guys a little bit more. Let's go ahead and just bump up our velocity a little bit. This is going to be probably below our spaceship, so we're going to just make this a number. It's a negative, so that we can pull these down a little. Now, as we pull it down, we can take a peek. Looks like we've got almost like a little waterfall rain going there. So we're going to make our scale. We want to maybe scale these up just a little bit. There we go. And we also want to tighten this up. If you notice, again, this is back to our ellipsoid where we're actually emitting all these particles from. So let's go back to our ellipsoid here. And let's take this down. Let's even just set all these. We could set these to 0, 0, 0. You can see that it comes out in just one spot, one fine little line right there. Which means we could also bump up the size of it. So let's say we take this to a 1 by 1. We get a pretty solid stream out of that. Maybe we want to make a little variation in here. Let's go for like a 0.5. And we'll do a 0.75. And then we can also look at how long do these last. Again, the energy, the lifespan of this. We could set these down a little bit lower. We can start to see it tails off, and we've got a nice little spot right in here. I'm going to go ahead and turn my grid off. I'm just going to turn my display settings back on. And let's set this down to maybe a 0.25 so we get a little bit of a variance in there. And then the energy level, how fast is this pushing out? We've got 0.5. I'm going to push this up just a little bit, just to get this a little bit longer. We'll take it up to a 1 and see how that does for us. The emission amount, we're at 50. Do we really need 50? A great way to test is just to drop it down, say 10 and 10. Do we have the same effect? Are we more or less what we want? We're kind of close, but we could bump this up maybe to about 10 and 20. I guess close for right now. What we may notice is that as we start to drag it, do we start to lose the shape that we have? If we do start to lose the shape that we have, then generally it means that we're going to need a handful more particles to work with. With the length of the scale, we'll tone this back down just a little bit more. Let's rotate around, take a peek. So you can see inside of the game view, if this were behind our vehicle, we're looking pretty decent with it. I just like nice even numbers, so I'm going to take this to a 3. And I'm going to give myself just a little bit of a variation. Not much, just real subtle. Side to side, so we have a little wavy effect as it goes. Nice little effect like that. Okay, so our ellipsoid's set up, our velocity is set up. We've got our stretched particles set the way we want. Now let's go ahead and go back into our particle animator. And in the particle animator, we're going to go ahead and adjust some of these colors so we can get just the effect that we want. For our flame, we're just going to do a little bit of a yellow and red in there. We'll take this more to maybe an orange or even just a red. We'll make this a special type of flame. Doesn't exist in reality, but in our game it does. There we go. Okay, so we've got our flame that we're going to use for behind our spaceship as it flies around. You can see that as we drag it, we do still lose some of that shape. So that's going to go back to our emitter up here. We can go back and we can change up either the energy, make it last a little bit longer, or we can go in and change up the amount of particles that we're actually using. So let's say we bump this back up to 50. Here we're getting a little bit better of the particle hanging into and holding its shape as we move it side to side. So we'll hang on to this one. This will work for us. We'll go ahead and change our particle name to, we had explosion before, this will just be our jet. And let's go to our project. Let's go to our prefab, and we'll create a new prefab. Call it our prefab jet, and we'll drag that one into it. And we can go ahead and get rid of this one from our hierarchy. So now we've got our explosions, we've got our objects that we're going to be using. So we're pretty much in good shape. The only thing we don't have yet is our audio. And we'll make some audio next.